Okay, let's unpack this. We've done deep dives into finance, history, even the politics of interstellar travel. But today, you brought us a source stack that really takes us off the usual map. We're looking at a transcript from a deep hypnotic session, and it's focused entirely on the metaphysical side of animal life. Their consciousness, karma, soul paths. It's pretty out there.
It is highly unconventional material, definitely. And look, when we approach sources like this one, relying on telepathic or deep state exploratory stuff, our job isn't really to validate the process itself. It's more about synthesizing the specific claims, however challenging they might seem, and just laying them out clearly.
Exactly. Our mission here is to extract the findings. Do animals have individual awareness? What's their role with karma? And what does this material actually say about that bond? The connection we feel with our pets. Because you should prepare for some potential cognitive shifts here. What the source suggests about the owner-pet dynamic, well, it's genuinely eye-opening.
Yeah, and to really grasp anything that follows, we have to start where the source does. The basic architecture of the animal soul. And the very first finding, it really challenges our usual ideas about animal individuality.
Right. That's the big question, isn't it? Do they have a proper individual consciousness?
Yeah.
Like a self that exists beyond the body?
Well, according to this material, generally, no. They do not possess what the source calls a form of proper consciousness, at least not in the complex way humans might understand it. Their awareness seems to function differently.
Wow. Okay, that's a huge claim right off the bat. So if consciousness isn't individual for them, what structure does the source propose? How are they grouped?
What it describes is animals operating less as individuals and more within a vast collective consciousness. And these are grouped by species type. So the source talks about like a single collective awareness for all birds, another one for all reptiles, another for amphibians, and so on. The individual animal is sort of a localized expression of that bigger field.
Huh. Almost like an antenna picking up a huge broadcast signal rather than running its own internal software.
That's one way to think about it, yeah.
Okay, so if that's the setup, where do humans fit in? How does our consciousness compare in this model?
The material draws a clear comparison. It suggests human consciousness, especially if it's actively worked on or developed spiritually. It's described as being further ahead than the animal consciousness.
Further ahead, so like more complex or on a different level.
It implies a difference in, let's say, developmental complexity and reach. Not that animals lack spirit, but that it operates on a different scale, perhaps a less individualized one.
Okay, that comparative scale. It leads us straight into what might be the most complex bit in the source, karma. If animal consciousness is collective and less developed, I guess that must change the rules for karmic consequences pretty drastically. Do animals carry their own individual karmic load like humans are supposed to?
The finding here is, well, definitive, according to the source. Animals do not carry their own individual karmic debt. The source uses the term karmica.
Yeah.
They seem to be exempt from that kind of consequence cycle.
Exempt, okay, but hang on. If they don't have their own karmic debt, how does the material explain suffering? Especially with pets, Pets clearly experience distress, illness, hardship sometimes. What's the explanation there?
Right, and this is where it gets really, really profound and maybe a bit difficult to grapple with. They assume the karmic consequences of their human owner.
They what? They assume the owner's karma.
Yes. The material explains this as like a fundamental agreement. It's accepted by the collective animal consciousness when it agrees to enter the matrix, physical reality, alongside a specific human.
Wait, hold on. So they absorb our burden, our negative stuff. That completely flips the script on the owner-pet relationship. So if a human is, say, aggressive or has some negative karma they're working through, the pet takes that on energetically.
Precisely. That's the claim. The pet might suffer the consequences of that human's karma. And this could manifest as the animal becoming aggressive itself or developing illnesses. It's described almost as a symbiotic role, even a sacrificial one, that the collective consciousness undertakes willingly to help the human's journey.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot to take in. And this willingness, this acceptance of the burden, it seems tied to how they view death and reincarnation, which the source says is really different from how humans see it.
Yeah, the key difference highlighted is the lack of apegos, deep attachments. Animals are described in the session as being more wise in this regard because they're consciously aware, apparently, that they are just passing through this physical life. So they accept death or transcendence much more easily than humans typically do.
It sounds like they inherently get that life on Earth is temporary, a short experience. And then you contrast that with us. The source suggests humans get totally weighed down by attachments, material things, relationships, fears, these epigos, and we forget our true essence, our spiritual nature. We're the ones terrified of death, clinging on to this physical plane.
Exactly. It suggests the animal's path is, in a way, cleaner. It's not burdened by that material fear that can paralyze humans. And maybe that lack of attachment is what allows them to accept this idea of karmic absorption. They know the physical suffering is temporary, just a service they perform before returning to the collective.
Okay, this idea of service, of their role alongside humans,
Yeah.
it brings us to one of the darker findings in this source material: external interference. The transcript states pretty clearly that animals can be manipulated
Right.
by entities, aliens, other external consciousnesses.
Yes, it does. And this manipulation is described as energetic. It's designed to alter the animal's energy field, often specifically to make them aggressive. But the interesting part is how this happens, the pathway of the attack.
It's not usually a direct hit on the animal, is it? Can you detail that process, especially in, say, a situation where a pet becomes aggressive, maybe in an abusive household?
Right. According to the source, the entity often targets the human owner first. It influences the human, making them aggressive, maybe fearful or violent. The animal is then living in this constant environment of fear or negativity. That fear activates terror in the animal naturally, which then can escalate into rage. And that's when the external entity connects to the animal, manipulating that rage.
Okay. And here's the really crucial, often misunderstood part, right? The animal's reaction. The source says the animal, because it can perceive the entity attached to the human, often becomes aggressive because it knows it's fighting the entity, not the owner.
Exactly. It's like the animal is trying to defend its territory or even defend the human from this unseen interloper. But of course, the entity feeds off all of it. The dog's rage, the human's initial aggression or fear. It becomes this negative energetic feedback loop designed to generate the maximum amount of, well, negative energy from the situation.
It's a grim picture. To make these ideas about attachment and these difficult transitions more concrete, the source material includes a very specific case study, a really emotional one, actually. Nikon.
Ah, yes, Nikon, the Russian dog. His story really highlights this theme of attachment, but in a way that almost seems to challenge the general rule of non-attachment for animals.
It's quite the story. Apparently, Nikon waited 10 years outside his owner's office after the owner died suddenly of a heart attack. 10 years. The source describes this as a profoundly deep epego, an attachment. Nikon saw his owner as a great friend who treated him like a son. And get this, Nikon eventually died of old age while waiting, but his spirit was still there, waiting for his owner to come back for him.
10 years, even in spirit form. At level of loyalty, that depth of attachment, it's genuinely heartbreaking. It really drives home how powerful these connections can be, even if the general tendency for animals is less attachment than humans.
So in the session, when they contacted Nikon's spirit, how did they resolve that attachment?
They asked him where he felt it, physically. And Nikon located the feeling of this deep attachment in his skin. Once that specific energetic tie was eliminated or released during the session, he reported feeling better. Ready to move on, finally. Ready for a new path.
Wow. Did they find the owner's spirit too? What was his perspective?
They did. The owner's spirit was apparently located in a peaceful, white place, not yet re-embodied, and he expressed shame and pity about Nikon waiting for so long. He said he couldn't go back to collect Nikon because he had to respect Nikon's time of life. So the friendship was real, deeply honored, but their different spiritual paths ultimately had to be respected.
That's incredible. And did the source mention anything about Nikon's experiences before being a dog? Any past lives?
Just a brief glimpse, it mentioned his previous incarnation was observed as being a white bear. And this life as a dog, Nikon's life, was apparently his very first canine experience on Earth.
A white bear to a dog. That's quite a leap. Maybe that explains the unusual intensity of this attachment in that particular life.
It's possible. The source doesn't explicitly connect those dots, but it's an interesting detail for sure.
Okay, so moving towards resolution or liberation, what does the source say about helping an animal that's still living but seems aggressive or interfered with?
Well, since the core issue, according to this material, often lies with the entity interfering with the human in the environment, the path to freedom for the animal really depends on changing that environment.
So what's the practical advice?
The most direct way for an animal to self-liberate, it says, is simply to escape, to get away from the negative environment or the aggressor. If escape isn't possible, then removing the animal from that situation. Taking it to a completely different place with different people, different energy. That's key.
Because that breaks the energetic link.
Exactly. Once the human, who is the primary target of the interference, is out of the picture, the animal's energy field tends to stabilize pretty quickly. It's no longer absorbing that aggression, no longer needs to fight the entity tied to the human. The fight is essentially over for the animal, and that karmic absorption role is released.
Okay, so to sort of tie all these fascinating and frankly quite challenging pieces together, from collective consciousness to this idea of sacrificial karmic absorption to interference, the source ends with a pretty big philosophical takeaway, doesn't it? About the purpose of all this.
It does. It uses a powerful metaphor. It suggests that this reality we experience, with all its good and bad, the light and darkness, love and hate, it's essentially a schoolhouse, or maybe a place of experiences. And that applies to plants, animals, and humans alike. We're all here learning. It's all seen as a necessary path to eventually return to where we originated from.
So every experience, no matter how joyful or how painful, serves this ultimate purpose of learning and growth. And animals, in this view, are sort of temporary willing participants, helping us with our difficult lessons here in the schoolhouse.
That seems to be the core insight you can extract from this particular source, yes. The complex, maybe non-individual nature of animal consciousness as described here, and this profound, almost sacrificial role they appear to play in relation to human karmic burdens and our struggles with attachment.
Well, thank you for joining us on this particularly mind-bending deep dive into this very extraordinary source material. It certainly gives you a lot to think about. And maybe here's a final thought for you to mull over. If this source is suggesting animals view life as a conscious, temporary transition, largely without our human fear of transcendence, what might that imply about how you view your own attachments, your own fears, and maybe your concept of life's ultimate finish line? Something to consider until the next deep dive.